Hey,
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the God Squad Pod. I am Dylan Neighbor Cruz, the tattooed theologian, and as always, I am joined by the talented, the amazing, the wonderful December Rose. Good evening, Dee.
what's happening, Dylan? What's happening? What's going on in the world? What is going on?
Uh, I think I need to go to my chiropractor because my head keeps spinning around and around and around with all the nonsense that's going on in Washington D.C. It's hard to keep up with. The information overload is real, and the effects of that information overload is real. Um, it I don't know about you, but it's weighing heavy. It's weighing like a millstone, and not like a yoke that's easy and a burden that's light. Um, so that's But just before I came on, I saw that the Supreme Court said that the Trump administration has to facilitate the return of Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia from the brutal prison in El Salvador, but they didn't stipulate how that's going to be done. So I don't
Yeah.
know how long it's going to take. And what about the other, what did they say, 75 to 90% of the people that were sent down there didn't have criminal records? What about
No,
all those people? Um,
not only didn't have
yeah,
criminal records, they don't have any charges that were actually brought against them. So they just rounded up these
right.
folks from on a plane and sent them down there. At minimum, they could have actually tried to fabricate some charges or something. They literally
Well,
just rounded up these folks. If they was Hispanic with a tattoo, that's good enough.
yeah, and I've heard Carolyn Levitt, who I don't know, the mouthpiece for fascism is always going to be somebody I'm not going to care for very much, but uh, keep insisting, and other people keep insisting that he is a criminal and that he is a violent criminal and he deserves to be where he's at. And this is baseless. This is absolutely baseless accusations from government mouthpieces, all the way up to and including the vice president of the United States, a man so unpopular that he makes Ted Cruz look popular, which
Now
is
you,
hard to
you
do.
you doing something if you can make Ted Cruz look popular. What about the Maganomics, we're gonna call it the Maganomics.
That's good.
The yes, we're gonna tariff the crap out of everybody, and no, we're not. Yes, we are, but no, we're not. And also buy the dip. And also it's a great time to get rich right now. And also you might want to buy right now. And guess what? I'm not gonna do tariffs. So the all I don't know if this is what insider training outside look like, but this look like outside insider training. It's trading.
I,
What about
I
you?
mean, it looks super duper suspicious and illegal as all get out. And, didn't they fire a bunch of people at the Securities and Exchange Commission right after he took office so that they don't have enough people to investigate this kind of stuff?
And
And
all those inspector generals, like 17 of
yeah,
them.
and it seems to me that Donald Trump is some kind of idiot savant because the man's not intelligent, but he does have some kind of uncanny knack for law breaking and mafia style ways. And that's what this reeks of. Like, he learned about tariffs from Pete Navarro, who made up an economist with an anagram of his own name,
Yes.
and Jared Kushner bought that dude's book, and so here we go. And then somebody was like, "Hey, behind the scenes, if you do this, we can start making more money." He even went on to say in the White House, he pointed at two people and said they made millions. It was pretty great. Like, it's on record. Martha
Mm-hmm.
Stewart went to jail for this stuff. Lots of people go to
She
jail for
did.
this stuff.
She
Um,
did. It's
I've
real.
said it before, and I'll say it again. Now would be a fantastic time for all the people who took an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution, whether they're in the military, the CIA, the Department of Homeland Security, or the FBI, or the U.S. Marshals, or whoever the heck, to step up and do their damn job for the Constitution.
Listen, I
Because
wouldn't. I wouldn't hold your breath. It doesn't seem like the Republicans have the backbone to call out any of these things. It doesn't seem, and the Democrats are doing what they can. I will say this: the protests over this past was it weekend were phenomenal. People did turn out for the hands off.
Yeah.
Hundreds of thousands of people all over the United States, even internationally, turned
Mhm.
out for the protests, and I think that was awesome. I'll say my folks, most of us stayed home, which was the prescription of the day. I believe that
Yep,
that
I
was the
saw
right
that
thing
here.
for us to do, because I think that in this is just my personal opinion. I'm not big on conspiracy theories, but in this day and age, I'm certainly big on paying attention to the signs of the times. And I believe if
Mhm.
we had turned out in those kind of numbers, they would have probably enacted martial law. It would have been the message would have been lost. You would have had a bunch of those neo-Nazi clowns out there antagonizing folks and starting things, and the message would have been lost. And so most of the us we call the 92% whatever, our prescription of the day was to stay home and let people do what they did, and I think it was successful, and I think that worked, and I think there is a reason why the message was able to go over smoothly, because they didn't have to stand up against police and riot gear with tear gas and rubber bullets, and that's
Yeah.
fine with me as long as the purpose of the protest is able to stand, the word gets out, the point was made. That's fine with me. I'm happy about it. I'm glad it worked.
Yeah. I saw estimates of anywhere from 3.5 to 5 million people nationwide.
Mhm.
And you've still got Republicans saying that they're all paid. I don't know people with that
That's
kind of
getting
money.
real old. That's getting real. How
I
you
mean,
get?
yeah,
We must got billions and billions of dollars to pay people to be protesting all over the world, to pay people to go travel around to these town halls.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
going to
It's a
pay
good
people to.
gig if
I
you can
mean,
get
that
it.
is going to be their shtick, and from now until kingdom come, they're paid. Everybody's paid. Was everybody
Yeah,
paid that show up at Trump's rallies? Those people weren't paid. That was authentic, right? It's
yeah.
so old and so tired.
It is. It is. But yeah, the Maganomics. The rampant lawlessness is what's really chaps me, and the haughty, brazen, just we can do whatever we want with impunity kind of attitude. And there's a lot of stuff in the Hebrew Bible about people like that, and how God's going to take care of them. Um, it's just making it hard to even turn on anything that looks like news right now. So yeah, whew, it's been another week, but we have a fantastic show tonight because we have a wonderful guest. And December, would you like to introduce our wonderful guest?
Yes, I am so excited to introduce the Reverend Angela Danker. She is an award-winning author, an ELCAU Lutheran pastor, veteran journalist. Her first book, Red State Christians, was the 2019 Silver Forward Indies Award winner for political and social sciences. Her second book, Disciples of White Jesus, which is what we here to talk about tonight, the radicalization of American boyhood, came out this past March, and she is a columnist for the Minnesota Star Tribune and has written for many publications, including Sports Illustrated, The Washington Post, and Fortune magazine. And she's appeared on CNN, BBC, Sky News, and NPR to share her research on politics and Christian nationalism. She is joining us tonight from Minneapolis, where she is living the La Vida Loca, exposing these crazies with her husband Ben and her two sons. And we are just ecstatic that she is joining us tonight. So welcome, Reverend Doctor, the right Reverend Angela Danker. How you doing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm loving that introduction. I'm going to get you to come to all my events December. That was great.
I'm here for it. I'm here for it.
I'm glad to be here. Love hearing about the commentary about the protest, because my parents actually went to a protest here in the suburbs of Minneapolis, and I don't think they've ever been to a protest before. And they brought signs and they brought some friends. So I think, it is good to see some of these white Christian sort of quiet, self-proclaimed, maybe moderate folks getting out there and sharing their dislike of what's going on in this country. I was glad to hear your take on it.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So tell us a little bit about, how did you come to this place where you are dissecting, exposing, teaching about, preaching about, you know what I'm saying, heralding and being the bullhorn of the nature and danger of Christian nationalism and how that's impacting white males especially, but the church as a whole, because this is not anything new. Your first book tackled some of that too with Red State Christians. So how is it that you came here? And were you always in this place? Or did you come from a fundamental place to this place? Was there a journey to here? Or you always been like, these folks is crazy as hell and I ain't with
it? No, it's been a bit of a journey. So I was brought up in the Lutheran church. I have a mom whose father was a Lutheran pastor, and he was actually outspoken in the Lutheran church in the 1960s and 70s for civil rights, against the Vietnam War, and he paid dearly for that. So there's a bit of that legacy in my family. My great-great-grandfather came over from Germany as a pastor and was pastoring all over the country. And we've certainly, on that side of the family, been on more the side of the social gospel and this idea that Jesus calls us into places seeking liberation and hope. My dad was brought up Catholic, but at the same time, I was a child of the 90s, so I was definitely surrounded by purity culture. I went to Baptist Bible camp, played the game Persecution in the middle of the night, where we had to hide from the Roman soldiers who were after us.
Oh, wow.
So, went to the University of Missouri and was in Bible studies where I was the only one who was baptized as a baby. So really shaped, both by my family tradition, but also by what I call sort of this dominant white cultural Christianity that we see really prominently right now in the Trump administration and the MAGA movement. And I really got to this place. Yeah, I started my career in the hockey locker room. I was a sports writer for a number of years, worked for daily newspapers, and then went to seminary, served my first call congregation in Chicago, served briefly in Las Vegas. But during Trump's first election, I was serving a large evangelical style, not quite a mega church, but large congregation in Orange County, California, located right next door to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library, and very in sort of Orange. If you know anything about Orange County Christianity, there's a lot of money, a lot of power, a lot of influence. Folks like Rick Warren, Saddleback Church. And I watched, I really had a front row seat to watching evangelical Christians line up behind Donald Trump, which led to my first book, Red State Christians. And then, Trump he won't leave us alone. And this movement keeps getting stronger. And we keep, I'm the mom of two boys. As my own two boys grow up, I see this violent masculinity in Christianity, which of course became the focus of my second book. So it was not necessarily intentional to be in this place. And I've been on my own journey of, learning how deeply rooted this movement is in white supremacy, in hierarchical gender roles. I didn't start out realizing the depth of the rot in white American Christianity. But I am grateful to have the opportunity to speak against it.
Well, having read your book, it really came across that it was an emotional roller coaster, so to speak, for you. I can imagine that you had some dark night of the soul kind of moments with some of the things that you described. So let's talk about the earlier chapters in the book where you go to South Carolina. I did not know that Dylann Roof, for instance, had black friends, which, that's such a racist trope. Oh, I got black friends, I can't be racist. Well, Thomas Jefferson had black children, but he was a white supremacist kind of thing. So kind of share with our listeners what that was like for you to go and investigate the churches in Charleston, South Carolina.
Mm.
Yeah, so the book kicks off in Charleston, and I spent some time interviewing folks at the Citadel, went to Mother Emanuel Church to really pay my respects and to understand the powerful history of that congregation in the movement of the Black church in American Christianity. And I did those things first. And then I knew that Sunday morning that I was going to have to drive from Charleston to go to Columbia, South Carolina, which is the hometown of white supremacist mass shooter Dylann Roof, but also home to his family's longtime congregation, the church where he was confirmed, the church where he grew up. And it's an ELCA Lutheran church, which is the same denomination where I grew up and I have been ordained in for over a decade. And you know, there was a big part of me that almost didn't even want to go, because I think what this whole thing speaks to is, you kind of touched on it when you're talking about how people want to establish real quickly, you know, well, I'm not racist for this reason or this reason. And there's this real tendency among white Christians to distance ourselves from those parts of our history and our legacy that we find distasteful, because there is a long history of Christianity that gets tied up in violence and empire whenever it becomes a religion of power and oppression. So I sense that, you know, even in the Lutheran tradition, where when people hear about a white supremacist mass shooter, they immediately want to think, well, of course, he's coming from conservative evangelicalism. Maybe he's coming from a megachurch. He's coming from indoctrination that's really obvious, like KKK. And I'm sure there were elements of some of that in Dylann's story. He was also predominantly radicalized online. And so a lot of the book is dealing with the online radicalization and the strength of social media influencers in radicalization. But what really the central point of this journey for me, similarly to Red State Christians, is to really force first myself and then other readers, specifically white Christians, to really remove the log from our own eye before we take the speck out of someone else's, and to really understand that in order to address the problems of white supremacy and the problems of religious-based hatred that we're seeing when it comes to immigration, when it comes to treatment on poverty, when it comes to attacks on public education or public health care, we're going to have to address those problems from an internal place, and not just by saying, well, that's somebody else's problem or that's an individual problem. We're going to really have to address it internally. So that's why I did go and visit and spent several hours speaking with the longtime pastor at that congregation and unpacking his own sense of shame and guilt and immense grief.
I remember in the early 90s, I grew up Southern Baptist, and then I married a graduate from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And I was a young Marine who had zero theological training, no higher education, whatever. And I asked her, why is it called Southern Baptist? I'd grown up in Blue Ridge, Texas, going to a Southern Baptist church, and it had never crossed my mind to ask about that. And I asked her because she had went to a seminary, and I said, does it have anything to do with the South and like the Civil War? And she said, no. And I was, and now that I've, got a history degree and went to seminary, it's like, okay, so the Southern Baptist at that time still hadn't unpacked that. Wow. And now you see people like William Wolfe saying that the Southern Baptist, and kind of conflating them with all Christians, want to see these mass deportations because somehow that's what Jesus wants. And wow. Yeah, it's that was a powerful aspect of the book when you talked about your own personal journey, and that pastor's dealing with his grief, knowing that this young man had been part of his orbit and had been in his church, and then went on to commit this heinous act.
And on the specific topic of race, one of the prominent quotes from your book is, too often white Christian boys in America are taught about race in a way that overemphasizes shame and de-emphasizes truth-telling and justice-seeking.
Yeah.
That is
Mhm.
that is clear on its face. But can you elaborate on that when you say that the shame is overemphasized and truth-telling and justice? We're actually seeing that manifest now in our government in real time. But can you elaborate on that a little bit as far as how that is portrayed and projected over the pulpit in the Christian church, in the white Christian church?
Yeah, I think shame has a silencing effect, right? And when we, have congregations that really emphasize and try to really kind of steal the message of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and say, well, all he really wanted was for us not to see color. And so we should just not talk about,
Mhm.
we shouldn't talk about race. It's kind of like when, you're brought up and you're told, well, we shouldn't talk about sex. It becomes something that's shameful,
Mhm.
rather than, for boys who are being born and brought up in this day and age, if there's just more honesty about this is the reality. Like the reality is, yes, the Southern Baptist Convention was formed as a direct defense of slavery. That is part of the legacy. And so as part of that chapter in my time in Charleston too, I visited another congregation and interviewed young teenage men and boys about their role and their understanding of Christianity. But one of the stories I learned in that church is that they had made this horrifying discovery that their congregation, again, a Lutheran congregation, pretty progressive at this point in time, had owned a human being uh,
Mhm.
many years back in their history. And they're not the first church to make a discovery like this. But what they did that I thought was powerful is rather than cover it up, they said, okay, we're going to own this and address it. And we're going to be really honest about what happened. And we're going to work with some local anti-racism educators and leaders to walk our church through how do we repent of this? How do we make some kind of reparations? And I think just that honesty is really, really important. And I think for me, even personally, like understanding, how to talk about the role of white supremacy in this movement, it's been a process of that really healing can only come when we're honest. And that's like the foundation of Christianity too, and really the foundation of
Mhm.
Lutheran theology. We call it the first use of the law. The first thing you're supposed to do is acknowledge your own sin. Um, and I think that we're just paralyzed when we can't do that. And you certainly see this with some of these disciples of white Jesus, male political leaders that we have in Trump's orbit right now. They are so afraid of admitting any kind of insecurity or fault or shortcoming that they're paralyzed by this veneer of superiority that is really, really thin.
It's very thin. It doesn't take much to crack it either. And this whole thing about being disciples of white Jesus goes far beyond race, to the literal identity of God. And where if you they in my opinion, they believe that Jesus is a white cis male Republican. They an American too. He's also an American.
Yes.
Too. So in case you didn't know, he's a white male Republican American. Just so you know, I didn't know, but And so one of the other quotes from your book is, young men and boys have not been given the tools for building mutual relationships that are bound together not by control, authority, or obligation, but instead by love and respect. And I hate that we keep referring to this current administration, but it is the best example of this right now, where they'll tell you out of one side of their mouth that they're Christian, and then out of the other side of their mouth they'll tell you that empathy is wrong. They'll tell you out of one side of their mouth that they're Christian, and then out of the other side they'll justify how they're treating the immigrant. You understand what I'm saying? And their entire relationship with everything that they do is about control and authority. That's it. And money, definitely that. But control, money, authority, and power. none of it is based in love. None of it's based in respect. And you can tell it's not based in respect by even how they talk to each other in their own, in the government, between themselves. They talk crazy to each other. And then the things that they say about others. JD Vance was on an interview the other day and said out of his mouth, and this is the thing when you have a whole bunch of people backing up the foolishness of each other and being in an echo chamber, because I don't think 5 years ago he would have had the guts or balls to say this. But being that they have their white nationalist champion in the White House, people are feeling emboldened these days to say and do things out loud that they would have never said, that they would have said inside, indoors, and in hushed tones. You know what I'm saying? And he said the other day about the whole thing with the tariff war with China and this and that we are borrowing money from peasants and then we're buying things that the peasants are manufacturing. And I thought, this,
Wow.
yeah, I like, did you just say that out loud? And by nature of a person being a peasant, how they gonna loan you millions of dollars anyway? So just the thought process behind that is just wild to me. But it's crazy. It's crazy that everything is about power, everything is about control, and everything is about superiority. And when you are that focused on being superior over everybody, to me, that screams insecurity. To me, it screams I'm not enough. It screams I'm not qualified. It screams everything that you're trying to project onto others is saying it about you. To me, that's just my position on it.
Yeah. I mean, in my life, starting my career in sports writing and working in a lot of male dominated fields, and now I'm married to a man. I've got two boys who are preteens. I have seen what it looks like for men to really inhabit their masculinity in a healthy and comfortable way, and really living into the identity that God created them to be. And it looks really different than JD Vance. It looks really different than Donald Trump or Pete Hegseth or Elon Musk. And there's a real contrast there. But as you say, this commitment to hierarchy, it is in some sense nothing new, but they have committed so strongly to it in their theology, in their books, in this alternative media landscape that they've created for fundamentalist Christians in this country, such that people don't even consume secular national news media, but they're only consuming media that's filtered through this hierarchical lens with white men at the top. And it really makes it difficult for heterosexual marriages to thrive. I've seen this on an anecdotal basis when people are being asked to perform according to strict gender roles. We had to learn this in the church when the church would try to insist upon LGBTQ folks not being able to inhabit their identity, who they were created to be. It leads to disaster. And you see the same thing with these strict gender roles for men and women. It's just creates violence, oppression, depression, all sorts of things that lead us to a place where it's really hard to live together in community and show love for one another.
I wonder if JD Vance knows that Jesus was a peasant. I kind of doubt that he does. You focus a lot, and with good reason, on somebody I first encountered in a documentary called Hellbound, which is a Christian documentary that features some Gerardian kind of thinkers about hell, and then Mark Driscoll is in there as kind of the foil. And when you wrote about Driscoll, you basically said that that thin veneer of his hyper masculinity, and I laugh at that kind of stuff because I'm a former Marine, but I also cry basically at every rom-com I watch because I have allowed myself to be the sensitive person that I was born as, and that was kind of stop your crying, I'll give you something to cry about kind of thing beat out of me for a while. And now, I've kind of freed myself from that.
That's awesome.
And I've been to therapy for many years. And I can't help but think, like, how much of this would be different if some of these jackasses just got a therapist. But I digress. So, Mark Driscoll, what can you tell us about Driscoll and the anti-gospel of his church? And I was just waiting for the moment when Jesus came running through his Phoenix church to start overturning tables and shit because of all of the self-aggrandizement and everything that you described. So for those who don't know, tell us about Mark Driscoll.
Yeah, well, I love that you bring up the story of Jesus turning over tables, because that's a favorite story of these folks, Christian nationalists and violent masculinity defenders. They love the story of angry Jesus, but they never admit that the reason Jesus is so angry is that his church has been turned into a place for money changers, and a place where people can make money. And that's certainly, if you go to Mark Driscoll's church, he's got all kinds of merchandise you can buy. He's got his books right out there front and center. I didn't see any Bibles for sale, but I saw a lot of Mark Driscoll's books for sale. So you can see who he really wants people to worship, and it's not Jesus. But Mark Driscoll, he really came to popularity in the 2010s. He was pastoring a church called Mars Hill in Seattle. There's a fantastic podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, that really looks at just the disaster that Mark Driscoll wrought in this megachurch. It became popular partially because they had really cutting edge musicians and music that was used in churches all over the country. They kind of brought in a harder rock sound to what was contemporary Christian music at that time. And Driscoll was also really passionate about saying, hey, the church has become too soft. We've got too many women in the church. He would castigate groups like the Promise Keepers, or make fun of men who were crying, make fun of men who were emotional or sensitive. And that was kind of his shtick. And he took off for a while because he was kind of the first person to begin to usher in a harsher form of Christianity. Now we know that they may have said that the church was too feminized in the 2010s, but this was still an era in America where most major denominations did not allow women pastors. So, let's not get carried away about how feminized the church was. But nonetheless, Driscoll ushers this in. He is known for his angry, yelling, long sermons, and he kind of goes down in flames in Seattle. It comes out that he's a terrible boss. He's been mistreating employees.
Surprise.
Right. He plagiarizes large portions of his book. He games the system to make the bestseller list by forcing his congregation to buy copies of his book. Writes a horrible book with his spouse about sexuality, and suggests that women should be constantly available to their husbands at any time, that's really the role of women. But as is so common in stories like Mark Driscoll's, he's not chastened by this experience of being driven out of his church. Instead, he is, utterly unrepentant, goes down to Scottsdale, Arizona, starts a new congregation, continues to rake in money from book sales, from media appearances, aligns himself with hard right political figures, aligns himself with Donald Trump, and has this second life now in this other congregation, and just becomes more and more extreme. So we see this failing upwards phenomenon, and also the inability of churches to hold misbehaving, misconduct, gospel distorting pastors accountable.
And I want to go ahead.
Go ahead, Dee.
There's a passage at the end of your sections about Mike Driscoll that I want to read. I believe it's relevant, especially for what we're seeing today with a lot of these podcast bros. I'll call them podcast bros. If you listen to some of this, what we call the incel red pill bullshit that these people be talking about, it's coming from somewhere. People like Mark Driscoll, anyways, I'm going to read this, and you'll be able to see, you can turn on the TV, you can get on social media, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, wherever, podcast, and you can just, it's almost palpable, it's almost tangible, this spirit that they're operating in. Some read this, it says, if this kind of teaching about creational gender roles disempowers, confuses, and even abuses women, what does it do to young men and boys? Told again and again that they are the dominant sex, created to rule over and have dominion over not just women, but the earth, the land, its animals, and all things on earth. It's often a rude awakening for young white Christian men when they enter the world and find that most created things are not interested in being ruled over by them. And you can see them because they're angry as hell all over the internet, okay? Telling women that they're going to grow by themselves and just have cats. They're all over the internet. And at the same time, these young men and boys have not been given the tools, which can be found in the creation story too, for building mutual relationships that are bound together, not by control, authority, or obligation, but instead by love and respect. Absent those tools, young white Christian men and boys instead often cast about for role models who fit the image of God they've been taught about. This is what I'm talking about, because this is why they love Donald Trump. A strong and violent masculine man who rules over everything in his presence. Many young white Christian men and boys saw that image in Donald Trump, who spared no words talking about his own proclivity to grab women by the pussy and take whatever he wanted from them. Trump's boorish comments may not have been what Piper, the proper theologian, had in mind, but they follow naturally from a theological model that privileges a gender hierarchy above all else and creates an image of God as power hungry and dominating, particularly when it comes to women. That's what we're seeing. That's why they love Donald Trump. That's why you got all these young, white, the self-proclaimed Christian males that follow after him, because he is the image of God manifested in the flesh that they have been preached to and taught about over the pulpit all these years. That's why there's no wrong that he can do. He said something about grabbing women. There's no wrong with that. He's cheated on his wife while she was pregnant. He cheated on his last wife. He cheated on the wife before that. That's all right. He got 5 kids by 3 baby mamas. That's okay too. He wrote some checks to the porn star to cover up, to make her be quiet so he could win the election. That's okay too. He's doing all this stuff with the money. Every other day we turn around, he's selling something. It's selling stuff out of the White House. That's okay too. If you're God, you can't do wrong. And they're going to make an excuse for everything that he does about why it's not wrong or why it's okay. And even if it is wrong, he's chosen by God, so that's okay. Yeah. And there's a reason for that. They've been programmed.
Yeah.
And what I want so much to make the connection in this book for people is that, I think that too many journalists and media people and politicians, they sort of just take at face value this idea that this is a Christian model. And so they're squeamish to address it because they think maybe people will be offended on the basis of religion. But what's really clear is that this is much more a cultural argument than it is a religious argument. The biblical support for gender hierarchy is so incredibly thin. And you really can't find it in Jesus at all. Jesus, we have the story of the resurrection because of the witness of the women who were the first to preach the story of Easter at the tomb.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Jesus had interactions with women where he told them to go out and preach and tell others about him. A woman was the first one to whom Jesus revealed his full identity as the Messiah. And so it's just so incredibly thin. And that's why they're so committed to this story of Adam and Eve, which, as you know, is only one of 2 creation stories in the Bible. They don't like so much the emphasis in the first creation story in Genesis 1 that every single human being is created in God's image. They want to think that only men are created in God's image and then women are in the image of men. And so it's really thin. But the commitment to this hierarchical teaching, again, it's much more cultural than it is religious. And so it impacts boys and men who don't consider themselves religious, who would say, well, Christianity is not all that important to me. The line between Christianity as a religion and Christianity as a word that denotes more about somebody's political beliefs is becoming really thin in this country. And I think journalists need to be aware of the ways in which they're using this word Christian that it's really not predominantly a religious term.
Yeah. Recently, I wrote a piece about the two creation stories. And the reason I did is because I engaged with somebody, as I often do as a public theologian online, who was talking about complementarianism. And I said, in Genesis 1, God creates humanity simultaneously. Sit with that for as long as you need to. And it just whooshed right over his head. He couldn't see the point that I was trying to make, that God's image simultaneously, male and female. And oh, by the way, some ancient rabbis saw 4 genders in that story, right? So let's leave the trans folks alone too while we're at it. One of the things that I loved about your book is that you didn't offer any sort of saccharine, cheesy solutions to this problem, but you told stories. And towards the end of the book, you mentioned how stories are how we make change. And that reminds me of Jesus, because Jesus told a lot of stories in parables and that sort of thing. So tell us some of the other stories that really impacted you from the book. And we did have a question earlier, and maybe you can tie this into the story thing. How do we address this in the real world?
Yeah. Well, I'll start with the stories piece. I think that the right wing Christian movement, the MAGA movement, has really understood on a gut level the power of narrative and offering really simple narratives for folks to make sense of their lives in a world that is overwhelming, in a world where we have all of this news, all this information rushing at us in a way that on a 24/7 basis, right in the palm of our hands and our phones. This is new in history. We've never had this before, and people are overwhelmed by it. And so people are searching for narratives to help us make sense of the world. And as the traditional church declines, and as religious adherence in general declines, and people don't have local faith leaders in many cases whom they are close to, who they trust, then people are looking around for other narratives. And so they've found this narrative about an angry, violent, masculine God who is power hungry. They've found this narrative that if only you can assume as much wealth as possible, that somehow you'll be safe from this dangerous world. So that is why I think there is such hope in crafting alternative narratives. And so every time I go and speak about the book and I see that there's dads in the audience and there's men in the audience who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s, I say, you are the best tools to begin to share your own stories about what masculinity has meant in your life with the people that are closest to you, to begin to craft these alternative narratives. And we have a lot of them in the book. And so I urge people, to hang on through those early chapters where you're getting a lot of pain. We're getting that big log out of our own eyes, because the book really does conclude with a couple of immensely powerful stories of hope. And certainly the hope is woven throughout the rest of the book as well, whether it's from parents in Arizona who are coming out of evangelicalism and looking to raise their own boys in a different way than they were, without this sense of shame around not subscribing to strict gender roles for their boys. And whether it's from, my time that I spent in rural Minnesota with a military veteran pastor who's hosting confirmation class with a bunch, mostly farm kids, in his garage, just up the hill from the barn that has chickens in it. And he's gathering them and he's asking them, who is Jesus? Tell me about Jesus. And he's dispelling these rumors and stereotypes that we have about Jesus' violence and anger, and instead, hear this man who has served tours of duty, who's suffered from his own military experience in some ways, is being vulnerable with the kids, and they're seeing that vision of Jesus through him as well. But finally, you'll have to read the book to really get the two great stories at the end. But I will say that one of the stories that I tell at the end, I found this story. I met this person before I wrote the book and before I knew I was going to do it. And hearing his story is one of the reasons I did write the book, because in some ways it's a reversal of the story of white supremacist mass shooter Dylann Roof. It's a story of somebody who did get involved with a skinhead group and became radicalized into white supremacy and stepped away from that. You see how close these lines are, right? He stepped from a skinhead group into becoming a follower of Mark Driscoll because something about it felt familiar to him, but became a pastor. And then through COVID, really, and through his own experience of deconstruction, he stepped out of Christian nationalism in Phoenix in the same neighborhood as Mark Driscoll, and is now working tirelessly to try to minister against Christian nationalism and to make his church a place that doesn't subscribe to this kind of hierarchical view of Jesus. So that's really powerful. So I think there's those ordinary solutions of really building trust in our own communities. The best tool of authoritarians is to diminish trust between ordinary people. But at the same time, right, we've got these building trust, creating narratives. You're not going to, bring down Donald Trump or Elon Musk with building trust and creating community. So at the same time, while people are working within their own communities with a sense of love and humility and creating grassroots connections, at the same time, we also have to be unafraid about speaking truth about the hypocrisy that we're seeing in major national Christian leadership, in prominent pastors, prominent politicians. And I think there needs to be just unvarnished truth-telling, both about the grift and the money that they're making on the backs of prosperity gospel and religion, and also about their own misconduct and the gap between what they profess and how they actually live and act.
Yeah, well, that's something that we strive to do here at the God Squad Pod, and when we talk on John Fugelsang's show too. That story of the little boy who wanted the American Girl doll, it reminded me of my own journey. Is in the mid '90s, I was chasing cows for a living, and I took a job in Iowa on a farm, and they had a little boy, and his favorite thing to play with was Polly Pocket dolls. And this was at a time when I was still very immersed in Southern Baptist culture. I was indoctrinated to be homophobic and bigoted towards the LGBTQ community. And that kid playing with those dolls was a big topic of conversation between myself and my then wife. And now I can look back at it and go, okay, that's just what that little boy wanted to do. BFD, right? Like, who cares? And I just thought it was so beautiful that they went to the mall and what was the doll's name? Twinkle Stars or Starry Twinkle or something. I can't remember, but it was a beautiful thing. And he was like, I can hear the doll. I need the doll. And they were just like, okay, this is what we're doing. And I love how those little things can just shatter bigger things. And that gives me hope on a sort of a micro level.
For sure.
Yeah.
I love that. And there's so many, what I like about this book, and what if you all can support this amazing author and go out and get the book, what you all will love about it is just the stories. Like, you're moving in and out of, it's like you're standing in the room watching a movie of these people's lives, and every once in a while the narrator will talk directly to you and then go back to narrating the story of these people's lives. And there's some wonderful, I love the story about the pastor doing the confirmations in the garage. I was going to read a part from that, but that part is so powerful. I think people should read that in the book. But on the heels of what Dylan was saying, there's another quote that's from your book that I believe that was actually kind of eye-opening for me. That was kind of a revelation for me. And that is, it says, in America, too often we haven't allowed white boys to experience normal anxieties and insecurities. We've taught them to push those feelings down. The reason why that spoke to me so is because that is something that white boys and black boys have in common. And you never think about that on the other side of a black man that's experiencing something at the hands of a white man is a black boy that had not been allowed to experience normal anxieties and insecurities, that is standing across from a white boy that was not allowed to experience normal anxieties and insecurities, and that was taught to push those feelings down to the point where he cannot see that black man as a brother because he was not allowed to have empathy for that black boy when he was a boy. And that could be a whole theological I could probably write a thesis on that. But the reality of it is there's a mirror there that we don't see or maybe not recognize. And it's a difficult, I will be honest and say that it's hard for me to have empathy for a racist. And it's hard for me to have empathy for a bigot and someone who's xenophobic and homophobic. And at the same time, I know that at some point, this grown man that is so hateful and that is speaking vitriol and foolishness out of his mouth, at some point, there was a little boy there that was having his humanity crushed into a box. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Forcefully molded and shaped to the point that he cannot see the humanity in others. And someone created that man. There used to be a boy in that spot. There used to be a boy standing in those shoes that didn't hate his black brother and his brown brother. There used to be a boy standing in those shoes that maybe did like to play with dolls at one point and now hates the queer community. There used to be a boy standing in those shoes that was kind to girls and now is online spewing hatred and calling women out of their name, lonely in the basement somewhere, telling another woman that they would never have a chance with to begin with, that she's going to die alone with her cats. You know what I'm saying? There used to be a boy. There's a broken white, for every broken black boy, there's a broken white boy. And that quote touched me in a different kind of way, because when I read that, I was like, for some reason, I never thought about that, but it is true. It is true that they have not been allowed to experience normal anxieties and insecurities and have had their entire world shaped for them. But at some point, you have to be accountable as an adult to shed the layers of hate that have been painted upon you year after year since you were a boy.
Yeah. No, I love that you bring that up. And I think that it really speaks to the incarnation of Jesus as this powerful center of our faith, that when God became incarnate in Jesus, that then God had this fuller understanding of what it was to be human by walking and living and breathing on the earth. And that's why so much of this solution and work is found in being able to see ourselves in one another, and for us to see common humanity with one another. As you say, as people become adults, they have to take responsibility to do some of that work, because at that point it's too late for parents or teachers or coaches to intervene for these boys. But I do see a lot of hopefulness in enlisting, especially really white moms, white moms of white boys, to be able to look at how are we responding to our boys when they cry? How are we responding to them when they display characteristics that we might think are effeminate, how are we responding? How are we treating them? And how are we showing them that empathy is a strength? It's not toxic. It's not anti-Christian. I mean, I think just the fact that that's a common trope right now on the right just really shows how far afield this movement has gone, and how, the quiet parts are just out loud and clear. And in some ways that should make it easier to confront and defeat, that it is just out there now. That's a source of hope too, I suppose.
Well, it gives us plenty to talk about on our show for sure. And one of the things, and I don't want to spoil it, but you do a fantastic job of highlighting the extenuating circumstances that these white boys that grow up to be radicalized go through. And I learned a lot of this stuff in my childhood. I had racist grandparents, racist parents. And I don't know how, other than grace, I've been able to do the amount of work that I've done and to shed as much of that as I have. And yet, there's still residual anger in me, like that pastor that you talked about who had been a skinhead. Sometimes he still feels that punk rock anger.
Yeah.
And I sometimes joke that Jesus would call me a son of thunder. And I struggle so much sometimes remembering my own extenuating circumstances, the indoctrination, the bigotry that I learned from church and parents and rural North Texas and all that. And I forget myself. And then I find myself with a plank in my eye.
Mm-hmm.
And I do feel called to call this stuff out, because so much of it is ideologically horseshit. And it's also so polar opposite of what Jesus looks like. Like, just literally sit down and read any one of the 4 gospels from start to finish. That's all. I mean, really, and then hopefully the scales fall off. What do you, putting on your pastor hat, what do you say to somebody like Dylan, not Dylan Roof, who sometimes still struggles to be gracious towards those folks who continue to spout this stuff?
I think I do really feel called to work with, especially faith leaders who are serving in rural or conservative environments, who are really steeped deep, as you say, in this indoctrination, in this cultural Christianity. And one of the things that I often reference to them is Jesus' words of instruction in Matthew 10, when he's sending out the disciples. And one of the things that he tells them is that they have permission sometimes to shake off the dust from their feet.
I just said that.
Yes. And I see, so many people, and I've experienced it myself, just becoming so worn down by feeling that, another biblical line that they're putting their pearls in some cases before swine. And it doesn't mean that I'm calling people swine, but it means that, when you're working so hard and you're giving all of yourself and someone's just not ready to receive it, it's a recipe for disaster and exhaustion. So I really want to give people permission to use that discernment. Doesn't mean you cut off the relationships, but it means that maybe you just set a boundary and say, I can't be in these conversations with you right now. I can't have you saying these things in my presence that are harmful to people that I love. I still love you. I want to keep the relationship, but I need to set my own boundary and space. So that's one, just permission of like shaking that dust from your feet when you need to, and giving yourself permission to use your discernment of like, where are places where I think community can foster and grow, because there are people everywhere, in every type of community. There are people who want to work towards love, towards grace. There are people who are willing to listen and to learn. So there's that piece of just not being too hard on yourself. And also just, in my pastoral perspective, but also just my human being perspective, I really think that those personal spiritual practices are really key, that you're in prayer or communion with that which you consider holy, that you're in communion with nature, that you're moving your body, that you're sleeping well, eating well, all of those regular practices of just caring for yourself enables you to be able to care for others. And I think that embracing and understanding your own God-given humanity and image of God really enables you to build that with others and to get through those times of sometimes righteous anger.
Yeah. I have to be careful from going from the righteous anger to the, oh, I'm forgetting where I grew up and how I grew up and all of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Well, this has been absolutely fantastic, Angela. I'm so thankful that you decided to write this book and join us tonight. Folks, pick up this book. If you have white kids in your family, if you grew up in macho white Jesus culture, conservative Christianity, or you're just curious about why Andrew Tate is a thing, read this book. It's fantastic. It's the kind of investigative journalism mixed with theology that I think really is powerful and a much needed book for today. So thank you, Angela, for joining us. Thank you for writing this amazing book. I look forward to seeing what you do next, because this is important public theology that you're doing.
Thanks to both of you, and keep doing what you're doing.
Yes.
We will. We will, definitely will.
Well, we have, I'm going to do what we close our show out with something called Word on the Street. And so one of the scriptures that was highlighted in your book, I will read for our Word on the Street tonight. And that is Luke 4:18, which is, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised. And 19 goes on to say, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. And Jesus had stood up in the synagogue and read this. And after this, it says he closed the book and he gave it again to the minister and sat down. And the eyes of all of them that were in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he began to say unto them, this day is the scripture fulfilled in your ears. And I just want to say to anyone that's watching, listen, whether or not you believe in God or not, whether or not you are a Christian or not, or you subscribe to any type of theology or not, the message there is being fulfilled through you today, this day, the day that you let love win over hate, the day that you let faith win over fear, the day that you let joy win over depression and despair, the day that you walk out of your house into the world and you decide to love your brother and not hate them, not to disparage them, the day that you decide to love and respect your wife and not abuse and oppress her, the day that you wake up as a mother, as tired as you are, and decide that you're going to do your very best and utmost to take good care of your children and to raise them up in the admonition of the Lord, or at least with a solid moral compass, whether you believe in God or subscribe to any religion or not, the day that you show up in this earth understanding that time is precious and that you are not above anyone, but that we all are a gift to the world and to each other, that is the day that that scripture and that spirit is fulfilled in the earth through all of us and through our collective work that we do. And so thank you again, Reverend Angela Danker, for joining us. And Dylan, thank you for joining me every week.
Always.
As we do here at the God Squad. I enjoyed this interview, and I'm just appreciative that we just get to have these moments on the God Squad with people like you, and that I get to share this stage with people like Dylan, who was once the boy that you speak of in your book, but there is hope. He is living proof. Dylan Neighbor Cruz, the tattooed theologian, is living proof of the hope that exists, that you don't have to stay that way. Just because it started that way, don't in that way. You can evolve and become and grow into a better and better and better and better version of yourself. It can happen.
It can happen.
It can happen. So y'all go out and get the book, and thank you for joining us. We'll be back this time next week, right? Will we, Dylan?
Next week. Next week.
Same bad time, same bad channel. Y'all be good and tune in this time next week. Also, tune in to Progress Radio 127 Wednesdays, 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with John Fugles. Tell me everything. We'll be there too. Y'all go get the book, all right? All right.